Welcome back to Ray University 302, the Harlem Renaissance, and we're in our final unit. We've examined class, patronage, infrastructure, and power, but there's one more intersectional point that we have yet to fully name. We celebrate Harlem's nightlife, we celebrate freedom, we celebrate experimentation, but we rarely say this directly. Many central figures of the Harlem Renaissance were queer, and people knew. So the real question isn't whether queer people were missing from the movement, it's why we remember them as if they were. Harlem in the 1910s through the 1930s functioned as one of the most sexually fluid Black cultural spaces in the United States. Migration, urban density, nightlife, and artistic experimentation created room for queer expression. But fluid did not mean safe. Queer life existed through coded language, performance, persona, and private networks. This wasn't purely secrecy, it was strategy. People inside the community understood, institutions pretended not to. Scholars have documented marriages shaped by social pressure and respectability concerns, what later scholars would describe as lavender marriages. Prominent Renaissance figures moved within queer social circles, wrote with queer subtext, and lived outside of heterosexual norms. Madam C.J. Walker's daughter, Alelia Walker's salons were famously queer-friendly and central to Harlem's party scene. Yet queerness was rarely named directly, then or now, and we have to wonder why. Because the Harlem Renaissance operated under intense respectability pressure from white patrons, Black institutions, and racial uplift politics. Open queerness was seen as a liability, a funding risk, and a threat to collective representation. So queerness wasn't erased, it was managed. Harlem allowed queer expression, but often in ways that could be publicly denied and privately enjoyed. This produced a split reality. Queer life flourished socially, but queer identity was muted institutionally. Black newspapers rarely affirmed it, major institutions avoided naming it, but everyone knew which clubs were that kind of space, and silence did not mean absence, it meant selective acknowledgement. One of the most visible and paradoxically tolerated queer spaces was the drag ball scene at Hamilton Lodge. From the 1910s through the 1930s, these balls drew thousands of Black queer participants, straight Black residents, and white spectators. They were photographed, widely known, and commercially profitable, but they were rarely defended. White fascination made them entertaining, but it also drew police, and police surveillance made them precarious. Visibility was allowed, protection was not guaranteed. Many of these people became victims of morality policing in Harlem. Then there were figures who refused to be settled. Gladys Bentley performed in tuxedos, openly sang about desiring women, and rejected gender conformity. She was direct, unapologetic, and beloved in Harlem nightlife, especially among working-class Black audiences. But as the 1930s progressed, policing intensified, economic pressures increased, and respectability politics hardened. Bentley's visibility became a liability, and her career narrowed. Her identity was later publicly disavowed under pressure. She shows us the line clearly. Queerness was tolerated as a spectacle, but punished as identity. Queer artists didn't just face homophobia, they faced economic discipline. Funding and publishing flowed towards patrons and institutions deeply invested in racial respectability, and this created a hierarchy. Queerness that could be coded survived, but queerness that insisted on being named struggled. The Renaissance absorbed queer creativity, but it did not consistently protect queer people. What the Harlem Renaissance makes clear is this: queer life was not absent, it was managed. Queer creativity was welcome when it could be stylized or consumed. Queer identity was tolerated when it stayed unofficial and deniable. The movement expanded cultural expression. It did not expand institutional protection equally. Before our next lecture, sit with this reflection question and leave your answer in the comments. If respectability once determined which Black identities were protected and remembered, what do we gain culturally and politically by refusing a single unified version of Black identity today? Next lecture, we kick off with the artists of the Harlem Renaissance, and some of these artists need no introduction. I'll see you next lecture.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our famous Cotton Club. I'd like to have the pleasure of introducing the greatest living master of jungle music, the rip-roaring harmony hound, none other than Duke Ellington. Let her go.
Welcome back to Ray University 302, the Harlem Renaissance. And during the Harlem Renaissance, Black artists were not just deciding what kind of art to make. They were deciding who their art was for. And that decision shaped their income, their stability, and their public image, and their long-term survival. Duke Ellington and Bessie Smith were both massively successful Black performers in the same era, but they built their careers in very different ways, and those differences shaped what success actually looked like for each of them. Bessie Smith came from extreme poverty. She began performing on Southern tent circuits and Black theater routes, learning her craft among working-class Black audiences. Performance for Bessie was survival first, not artistic expression or prestige. Duke Ellington, by contrast, was raised in a relatively stable Black middle-class household that emphasized discipline, manners, and education. He was trained early in how to move between social worlds. That distinction matters because it shaped not only their music, but who they imagined their audiences to be. Bessie's blues music was emotionally raw, sexually direct, and rooted in working-class Black life. She sang about abandonment, pleasure, violence, desire, and survival. Her work was deeply popular among Black audiences, but often criticized by Black elites as unsophisticated or damaging to racial progress. Figures associated with institutions like the NAACP, including our favorite, Du Bois, worried that blues culture reinforced racist stereotypes. Bessie primarily performed for working-class Black audiences, migrants, Southern touring circuits, and rent party networks. Her success came from Black demand. Duke's orchestral jazz moved in the opposite direction. He formalized jazz composition, expanded tonal layering, and created extended musical suites. He positioned jazz as serious concert music rather than dance entertainment. Duke rose to prominence as the house band leader at the Cotton Club, a whites-only venue located inside of Harlem that featured Black performers for white audiences. His live audiences were white, and his radio broadcasts were national. Both artists generated enormous cultural value, but they interacted very differently with white-controlled systems of distribution, ownership, and preservation. Bessie Smith, at her peak, sold hundreds of thousands of records through Columbia Records, toured nationally on the tour bus circuit, and became one of the highest-paid Black performers of her era. And she even starred in the 1929 short film St. Louis Blues. That was real commercial success, but it came with limits. She did not own her masters, had little long-term royalty protection, depended on live performance income, and remained structurally vulnerable to shifts in the market. When the Great Depression collapsed the Black consumer base that sustained her audience, record sales dropped dramatically, touring circuits shrank, rent parties replaced ticketed performances. By the early 1930s, her recording career stalled and income declined sharply. She died in 1937 after a car accident while touring in Mississippi, without a substantial estate to pass on to her family that she took care of. Duke also relied on white control systems, but he was able to move through them differently. He secured steady salaried residencies at venues like the Cotton Club, long-term recording contracts, national radio broadcasts, film appearances, and international touring opportunities. When the Great Depression devastated Harlem's cultural economy, Duke adapted by touring in Europe and expanding his compositions, reaching new audiences less dependent on Harlem's collapsing nightlife economy. He continued composing and performing for decades, eventually receiving institutional recognition from universities, foundations, and the U.S. government. Duke Ellington died in 1974 with an internationally celebrated legacy and a catalog that would continue generating value long after his death. Both artists were commercially successful, but Bessie's career was built through Black audiences, while Duke's was sustained through institutional access. And that difference shaped not just their earnings, but the stability of their careers, the preservation of their work, and the durability of their legacies. Their stories remind us that success during the Harlem Renaissance was never just about talent. It was about audience, infrastructure, and access to systems that could absorb economic shock. When the Great Depression hit, Black consumer markets collapsed first, and artists who relied primarily on those markets were hit the hardest. But those whose work could circulate through institutions like recording contracts, radio, salaried venues, and international touring, they were more likely to endure. Before our next lecture, sit with this reflection question and leave your answer in the comments. How did audience, access to institutions, and economic infrastructure shape which Harlem Renaissance artists were able to sustain success? Next lecture, we'll turn to Harlem's literary circles, where we see figures navigating the same pressures and see how questions of gender, folklore, and respectability complicated survival even further. I'll see you next lecture. Renaissance, Black writers were not just deciding what stories to tell. They were deciding who those stories were for and whether art should translate Black life or simply reflect it. Langston Hughes and Zora Hurston entered Harlem's literary scene at roughly the same time and quickly became two of the movement's golden children. They debuted at one of the National Urban League's opportunity dinners and moved within the same artistic circles, shared mentors and patrons, and even collaborated as friends, most notably on the literary magazine Fire. But they made very different choices regarding their work, and those choices shaped not only their careers, but how their legacies endured after the Renaissance ended. Both Hughes and Hurston benefited from early white patronage, most notably from Charlotte Osgood Mason, who funded their writing, travel, and research, helping elevate them into what many described at the time as the fanciest Negroes in Harlem. Her support helped elevate them within Harlem's literary elite, but it came with expectations. Mason favored work that documented Black folklore, rural traditions, and what she understood as culturally authentic Southern expression. Her interest was preservation, not protest. In exchange for financial survival, she expected artistic direction, and this is where Hughes and Hurston began to diverge. Langston Hughes made the deliberate decision to write for Black working-class audiences. His poetry incorporated blues rhythms, spiritual cadences, everyday urban speech, and racialized realities of modern Black life. Hughes believed ordinary Black life was already worthy of record and beautiful. He resisted pressures to sanitize dialect, labor, sexuality, or anger. Hurston made a different decision with her work. She documented Black Southern folklore and rural speech patterns through an anthropological lens. But she rejected protest literature and resisted the idea that art should serve racial advocacy. Hughes asks, how do we confront oppression through culture? Hurston asks, why must culture confront oppression to be valid? Their friendship deteriorated over both political differences and disputes around authorship and collaboration. Their benefactor, Charlotte, took a financial hit during the Great Depression, but remained able to support both artists. As the Great Depression deepened, Hughes left, increasingly uncomfortable relying on Mason's wealth while Black communities faced mounting poverty, and after ongoing conflicts with her. He moved towards class analysis, labor critique, and socialist politics in his work. Hurston, by contrast, resisted the expectation that art should serve collective racial struggle. She remained aligned with Mason longer, continuing her anthropological fieldwork that documented rural Southern Black life and folklore. By the 1930s, they no longer shared artistic goals or a common understanding of what Black art should do. Both writers received early recognition, but they interacted very differently with literary institutions, and those institutions responded accordingly. As the Great Depression hit, publishing opportunities contracted, patronage networks weakened, and interest in folklore declined in favor for explicitly political writing. Hughes published widely across poetry, journalism, and theater, adapting his work to magazines, radio, stage, and public lectures. He diversified his income streams and participated in government arts programs during the Great Depression, securing teaching positions and institutional affiliations that allowed him to survive shifts in political taste. Even as patronage declined, Hughes remained desirable to publishers, universities, and later Cold War-era institutions invested in promoting American cultural modernity abroad. Hurston relied more heavily on patronage and pursued anthropological fieldwork that fell outside of traditional literary markets. As publishing opportunities contracted and interest shifted towards explicitly political writing, institutional support for her work declined. Her resistance to protest literature and racial uplift mandates made her work harder to circulate within foundations, journals, and New Deal-era arts programs, prioritizing social realism and labor critique. As support faded, Hughes remained economically active through journalism, theater, and public speaking. Hurston increasingly worked outside of literary institutions, taking on teaching, clerical, labor, or domestic work. Hughes died in 1967 with an internationally recognized literary legacy. Hurston died in 1960 in relative obscurity and was buried in an unmarked grave. Much of her research remained unpublished or archived without circulation with Charlotte, and large portions of her work went out of print. In 1973, Alice Walker, author of The Color Purple, located Hurston's grave and helped mark it, sparking renewed scholarly and literary interest in her writing, including Their Eyes Was Watching God. Hughes and Hurston built careers through patronage, but Hughes oriented his work towards Black audiences, adaptable genres, and institutional circulation. Hurston oriented her work towards folkloric preservation and independence from political expectation. That difference shaped not only their income, but the preservation of their work and the durability of their legacies. Their stories remind us that success during the Harlem Renaissance and legacy after it was never just about talent. It was about audience, infrastructure, and whether your work could circulate once the money disappeared. Before our next lecture, sit with this reflection question and leave your answer in the comments. What systems or structures that function as gatekeepers for Black cultural production then still exist today? And how do they influence which voices are amplified, funded, or preserved? I'll see you next lecture. And we've examined how audience shaped Duke and Bessie and how patronage shaped Hughes and Hurston. Today we close our people section with a different question. What happens when your art is accepted by institutions versus when it threatens them? Both Countee, Cullen, and Claude McKay mastered European poetic form. Both were central to the Harlem Renaissance, and both were brilliant. But one was institutionally palatable, and the other was a threat, and that difference mattered. Claude McKay was born in Jamaica under British colonial rule. He grew up inside an explicit racial hierarchy shaped by imperialism. When he arrived in the United States, he did not discover racism. He recognized it on a larger scale. The empire where the sun never set structured his lens. Countee Cullen, by contrast, was educated in elite American institutions after being adopted by a Harlem pastor. He studied at NYU and Harvard and was deeply shaped by Christianity, literary tradition, and the belief that intellectualism and education provided legitimacy. Both represented Black modernism, but they entered Harlem asking very different questions. Both poets mastered the sonnet, a European form associated with refinement and discipline. McKay used that form to deliver defiance. His poem, If We Must Die, written during the Red Summer, transformed European structure into a vehicle for resistance. He wrote about labor exploitation, colonial violence, class conflict, and racial terror. He was not interested in comfort. He was interested in structural indictment. Cullen's poetry turned inward. In poems like Heritage, he wrestled with Christianity, suffering, doubt, and the tension of being Black inside of Western civilization. His tone was lyrical, sorrowful, and introspective. McKay named systems, capitalism, empire, and racial violence. Cullen examined identity, faith, belonging, and moral conflict. McKay wrote for rapture, Cullen wrote for recognition. As we've learned, audience shaped survival. McKay published in radical and international outlets and spoke to workers, migrants, and colonized subjects. He did not orient himself towards institutional comfort. Cullen's audience aligned more closely with literary institutions, academic spaces, and mainstream publishing. His work could be framed as philosophical, tragic, and universal. That made him easier to circulate. This is where legibility becomes structural. Institutions could absorb refinement and sorrow, but they struggled to absorb systemic indictment. McKay openly critiqued capitalism and imperialism. Publishers hesitated and institutions distanced themselves. Cullen remained within literary respectability. He was constrained but preservable. Neither poet escaped precarity, but their instability looked very different. McKay experienced financial insecurity, political suspicion, and constant movement across countries because of this. There was no institutional safety net, and he died in 1948 without full canonization. Cullen remained institutionally embedded, although his later work was slightly more radical but not really well received. Not necessarily because it was too radical by then, but because people thought it was overdone and he was late to the party. But he remained in professional respectability, taught future literary figures like James Baldwin, and fit more easily into the American literary canon. The Harlem Renaissance could absorb refinement, Christian struggle, poetic sorrow, and disciplined contradiction, but it struggled to absorb the empire as a system, capitalism as a target, and rage without apology. Cullen's work could read without discomfort to the powers that be, but McKay's required confrontation and reflection. Both Cullen and McKay mastered the same poetic form. Cullen asks, "How do I belong?" And McKay asks, "Who built the system and why?" The Harlem Renaissance was not harmonious. It was a negotiation between legibility and threat, refinement and confrontation, survival and indictment. Success was never neutral. It depended on whether institutions could live with your critique. For our next lecture, sit with this reflection question and leave your answers in the comments. If racism, capitalism, and colonialism operate as global systems, what are the limits of assimilation as a strategy for Black liberation? When does seeking inclusion reinforce the structures that require dismantling? Next lecture, we close out our semester by asking how the Harlem Renaissance ended and what happened when the Negro was no longer in vogue. I'll see you next lecture. Black modernism, culture, capitalism, and double consciousness. And we have not said that in a while, but we are in our capstone lecture. And at some point during every discussion around the Harlem Renaissance, the same question appears: when did it end? But that assumes that cultural movements end cleanly and neatly like trends do. So today we're asking a better question. Did the Harlem Renaissance actually end? Spoiler alert, it didn't. Most textbooks mark the early 1930s as the movement's end, citing the Great Depression, the collapse of Harlem's nightlife economy, rising unemployment, and the dispersal of artists. Clubs closed, publishers folded, and disposable income disappeared. For many artists, culture could no longer sustain a livelihood. This is where the story often stops, with an implication of failure. But collapse is not disappearance. We don't have to speculate about what happened. We've seen it through the lives of the artists that we studied. Zora and Hurston lost patronage as taste shifted and faded from public memory before later recovery efforts discovered her work. Langston and Hughes adapted and survived, renting, visible, but never fully financially secure. Bessie Smith built her success through black audiences, yet remained trapped within white-controlled recording and touring structures she did not own. Claude McKay's increasingly radical politics made him threatening, and he was surveilled, displaced, and pushed to the margins. Countee Cullen was celebrated while black art was fashionable, then quietly sidelined when institutional priorities shifted. Duke Ellington was a rare case. He maneuvered within white institutions and emerged with a preserved legacy and lasting stability. These were not personal failures, they were structural outcomes. And what ended was not black creativity. What ended was tolerance, funding, and institutional protection. When the cultural economy collapsed, artists adapted. Some became teachers, journalists, organizers, or government workers. Some entered universities, some joined labor movements, some disappeared from the archive entirely. During the Great Depression, New Deal programs like the Federal Writers Project unintentionally preserved elements of the Harlem Renaissance culture by funding documentation of folklore and oral histories. But this was not a luxury. This was survival labor, and black artists still face discrimination within these programs. The Harlem Renaissance didn't vanish, it transformed under pressure. Today, the Harlem Renaissance is often remembered as glamorous, jazzy, and optimistic. What often gets softened is the economic collapse, queerness, exploitation, policing, and class conflict. Why? Because a safe Harlem Renaissance celebrates creativity without challenging power. It sells culture without naming extraction. It inspires without demanding accountability. Freezing the Renaissance in the 1920s, aesthetically vibrant but politically unfinished, allows institutions to avoid confronting what came next: economic vulnerability, collapsing patronage, and disillusionment with respectability as a path to freedom. A sanitized ending turns critique into nostalgia and reduces survival to a footnote. The Harlem Renaissance did not fail, it evolved. Like the European Renaissance before it, it transformed rather than concluding. It reshaped black cultural and political life far beyond its most visible years, reframing how identity, resistance, and modernity could be articulated. It cultivated cultural confidence, political language, artistic networks, and a shared imagination of collective struggle. Later movements drew directly from that foundation, from the civil rights movement's reliance on Renaissance symbolism and language, to the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party's critique of respectability and assimilation, to global movements like Negritude, a 1930s movement in Paris, which rejected colonialism while affirming black identity. Harlem today tells a familiar story. Black culture fuels economies, black neighborhoods become brands, black creativity generates value, and black people are discarded once that value is extracted. From the jazz age to Mace to A$AP Rocky, black culture remains marketable while ownership and protection still lags behind. Different era, same pattern. James Baldwin, who studied under Countee Cullen, later reframed the artists of the Harlem Renaissance as survivors. Its artists created under pressure with limited protection and impossible expectations. They did not vanish. They mentored, they passed knowledge forward, and they shaped what came next. And that, too, is a big part of its legacy. So did the Harlem Renaissance end? Well, not in the way that the question is usually asked. What ended was not black creativity, but the conditions that briefly allowed it to be institutionally tolerated. Funding collapsed, patronage withdrew, and protection disappeared. What remained was more durable. The Harlem Renaissance trained a generation. It expanded the language of black self-definition, sharpened critiques of power, and built networks later movements would rely on. The artists we studied made different choices. Some pursued respectability, some rejected it, some wrote for the masses, others worked within institutions. There was no single correct strategy and no guaranteed protection. What united them was not style, but intent to live, create, and be seen with dignity inside a system built on extracting from them. The Harlem Renaissance leaves us with this lesson. Art can open space. Art can clarify thought. Art can prepare people for freedom, but art alone cannot deliver liberation. The Renaissance did not end. It echoed through every movement in black history where culture has been asked to carry political weight. From the bottom of my heart, if you have watched every episode, thank you so much for enrolling in Ray University 302, the Harlem Renaissance. It has been my pleasure to teach you guys. I'll leave you with our final reflection question. Leave your answer in the comments. Has Black America experienced another cultural renaissance since Harlem? If so, what social, economic, and political conditions shaped it? And how do they compare? I'll see you next lecture as we close the semester answering our capstone question. To what extent did the Harlem Renaissance succeed and fail as a strategy for Black freedom? I'll see you next lecture. Welcome to office hours for Unit 3 of Ray University 302, the Harlem Renaissance. And this unit is where everything we've built, ideology, patronage, respectability, capitalism, and audience becomes human. Today we're walking through Unit 3's reflection questions, and if you can answer these lectures' reflection questions clearly, you'll have the final piece to answer your capstone question. To what extent did the Harlem Renaissance succeed and fail as a strategy for Black freedom? Let's jump into the reflection questions. Lecture 9. If respectability once determined which Black identities were protected and remembered, what do we gain culturally and politically by refusing a single unified version of Black identity? My answer. The Harlem Renaissance did not erase queer life, it managed it. Queerness flourished socially, but was muted institutionally. It was tolerated when coded, punished when explicit. Refusing a single version of Black identity today expands cultural honesty, prevents historical distortion, and resists the idea that safety must come through silence. What we gain is complexity. What we lose is the illusion that identity requires conformity. Lecture 10. How did audience, access to institutions, and economic infrastructure shape which Harlem Renaissance artists were able to sustain success? My answer was, sustained success in the Harlem Renaissance wasn't only about talent. It depended on what economic system your work could reliably move through. Artists with stable infrastructure, like publishing pipelines, salary positions, radio and film exposure, touring networks, and institutional relationships, had more ways to keep earning when the market tightened. Artists whose success depended on fragile infrastructures, local club economies, cash nightlife, short-term gigs, and Black disposable income or patronage that could vanish overnight were much more exposed when the Great Depression hit, when tastes shifted, or when policing intensified. So who lasts pretty much came down to whose audience could survive a downturn. Lecture 11. What systems or structures that function as gatekeepers for Black cultural production then still exist today, and how do they influence which voices are amplified, funded, or preserved? My answer was, the gatekeepers have changed platforms but not structure. Then it was publishers, patrons, venue owners, and elite institutions. Today it's media companies, streaming platforms, universities, foundations, and even algorithms. They still shape who gets funded, who gets visibility, and who gets archived. Work that is profitable, legible, and low risk tends to circulate more easily. Work that is radical, confrontational, or structurally critical often struggles for sustained support. The continuity is this: visibility is never just about talent. It's about who controls distribution and preservation. Lecture 12. If racism, capitalism, and colonialism operate as global systems, what are the limits of assimilation as a strategy for Black liberation? When does seeking inclusion reinforce structures that require dismantling? My answer was, if oppression is structural and global, assimilation can only go so far. Assimilation works by proving worthiness within an existing system through refinement, respectability, or excellence. But if the system itself depends on racial hierarchy, economic extraction, or colonial power, then inclusion doesn't dismantle it. It simply expands who is allowed to participate. It doesn't help the many, it helps the exceptions. The limits of assimilation is this: it can secure recognition, but not transformation. In some cases, seeking inclusion can even stabilize the system by making it appear more fair without changing how it actually distributes power. So, the deeper question becomes, is the goal to be accepted inside the structure, or to change the structure itself? Lecture 13. Has Black America experienced another cultural renaissance since Harlem? If so, what social, economic, and political conditions shaped it, and how do they compare? My answer was, yes, depending on how you define Renaissance, Black America has had multiple Harlem-like moments. The Black arts movement of the 60s and 70s, hip-hop's rise, and more recently, the 90s Black TV and film boom, and the 2010s present digital era, where Black culture circulates globally through the internet. They share key conditions with Harlem: new distribution platforms, political upheaval, concentrated cultural energy, and debates over representation and respectability. The difference is scale and speed. Visibility today is faster and more global, but the core tension remains the same. Black culture can expand rapidly, yet ownership and long-term power often remains uneven. Unit 3 teaches us one major lesson. The Harlem Renaissance was never just about art. Respectability shaped visibility, and audience shaped income. Patronage shaped content, and institutions shaped legacy. And when the money disappeared, so did protection. And that concludes our lecture. Remember, your capstone question is this: to what extent did the Harlem Renaissance succeed and fail as a strategy for Black freedom? To answer this, you will have to show both where did it expand possibility culturally, intellectually, and politically, and where did it fall short materially, structurally, and economically. Your argument should wrestle with tension, not choose a side. And the Harlem Renaissance was powerful, but power is not the same as freedom. Unit 1 gave us context, Unit 2 gave us ideology, and Unit 3 gave us consequences. Your final task is to put it all together, and I'll see you next time for our final lecture where we answer this question. Thank you again so much, guys, for tuning in. I'll see you later.